Okay, continuing with our theme of discussing some of these big social questions of ethics and morality. In this video, we're going to be discussing arguments in favor of the death penalty, and then in the next one, we'll consider some arguments against the death penalty. So for today, you should have read Primoratz, Primoratz's argument in favor of the death penalty. And Primoratz's argument is sort of built on this idea of retribution. The retributive theory of justice, right? And retribution is the idea that something is due back to those who do harm, right? Harm should repay harm, more or less, right? And I think in many ways it's sort of a very gut, sort of deep down inside response that we have to harms and evils, right? So, for example, my 2.5-year-old, when I tell him that he can't have a cookie if he asks for a cookie, or that he can't watch TV if he asks for TV, or whatever, right? Sometimes he'll get angry and hit me, right? And, you know, I mean, he's just being a toddler in one sense, but also there's this other sense in which he's being retributive, right? And it's this very basic fundamental idea of justice, which is someone does wrong to you and you get to pay them back, right? That's more or less the idea that's hanging around here, right? There's this idea of lex talionis, right? One of the original laws, you can find it in Hammurabi's code, right? The idea that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Right? The idea that equal pay should be given to equal crime, right? So if you take someone's eye, then we're going to take your eye. If you take out their tooth, we're going to take out their tooth. If you kill them, we're going to kill you, right? Hence the idea of the death penalty here, right? More or less, that's Primoratz's argument, right? He thinks, just drop the cap here, he thinks that punishment should be equal to a crime. He thinks the only thing that's equal to a human life is a human life. So, if you kill someone, if you take someone's human life, the only way you can pay it back, according to Primoratz, is by facing death yourself. So DP death penalty here is appropriate. Indeed, even perhaps demanded by justice for murderers. That's more or less his central argument, right? If you kill someone, you don't deserve to live anymore. If you take someone's life, you have to pay it back with your own life, right? He just says that's just retribution. That's just how it works. Equal crime for equal punishment. Punishment fits the crime, we often say. And the only thing that fits in the case of loss of human life, he believes, is death, right? Okay. Now, the rest of his article, the rest of his essay, doesn't really focus on this argument, but instead focuses on ways he tries to defend himself from various objections that he often hears against the death penalty, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain what those arguments against the death penalty are, and then explain the response. So, one argument that you oftentimes see against the death penalty is that the death penalty, I guess he calls it capital punishment, but you know, the death penalty violates the right to life. And the argument goes, these are people who are against the death penalty. The abolitionists would say the right to life is fundamental, it's absolute, it's sacred, you can't touch it, right? And so the death penalty is wrong for that reason. He gives two objections here. First, he says, well, what about war? What about the killing that happens in war and self-defense? He says, more or less, we're sort of okay with that, right? And if we truly believe that this was such a fundamental, inviolable right, then we would say that you can't even kill in war and you can't even kill in self-defense. But basically, nobody says that, right? And so he thinks that, look, if you're okay with killing in war and killing in self-defense, then that's an implicit reason to be okay with killing in cases of the death penalty. But he also points out that rights have reciprocity. That is to say that rights are in place, more or less, it sounds a little bit like social contract theory, rights are in place reciprocally, right? There's some reciprocity there, right? If I steal something from you, then you might take some property from me, right? The government might take some property from me, right? I could be fined, right? That seems reasonable, right? Indeed, that if I violate someone else's right to property, then my own right to property might get violated as a result, right? There's some reciprocity there. He says, why not also for the case of life, right? That if I violate someone's right to life, it seems like maybe I abandon my own right to life, right? Or at least I lose some claim to it, right? Okay, that's his response to that first objection. Another objection that some people against the death penalty will say is they'll say, well, the death penalty is contradictory. It says, hey, everybody, don't kill, right? But then what does it do? It comes in and it kills, right? The government says, don't kill, but then they go ahead and kill people. And the idea is that's sort of weirdly contradictory, right? The government's on the one hand saying you shouldn't kill people ever, don't kill people, but then they go behind, they go and they kill people themselves, right? And so it seems contradictory, or it seems sort of maybe hypocritical, or it seems maybe like a bad example or something like that. Primoratz says, look, this doesn't work for other punishments. Imagine if we said, hey, government, you shouldn't be imprisoning people who kidnapped someone. Kidnapping is basically false imprisonment, right? You shouldn't imprison people who have kidnapped other people because that's contradictory, right? You're saying don't imprison people, but then you go off and imprison people, right? That doesn't really work, right? So he says this argument's not particularly strong, right? We're okay with imprisoning kidnappers. So contradictory or like hypocriticalness, that's not something we're concerned with because the government is able to do things that individual members of the public aren't allowed to do, right? So it doesn't seem like that's really the issue. Another one, Primoratz sort of deeply holds this idea that the only way to repay the loss of a human life is with another human life, right? The only way to pay back that loss is by yourself dying. But some people point out that lives are not equal. Right? People die at different ages. People have different years left to live. People have different amounts of wealth, happiness, etc. Right? There's all sorts of ways in which people are, oh my gosh, I keep hitting this. All sorts of ways in which people are not equal, right? And so this idea that the death penalty is equal pay for equal crime, or equal punishment for the crime, seems off to some people, right? Some people object and say, well, no, it's not, right? What if you have an 80-year-old who kills a 20-year-old? Killing that 80-year-old with the death penalty doesn't really seem equal to the loss of life that the 20-year-old faced, right? But what Primoratz says in response here is, he says, well, look, the equality is not one of equal years left to live or something like that. It's an equality of dignity. It's an equality of worth or something like that, right? Every person is equally valuable, even if they don't have as long left to live or something like that, right? And so because you disrespected that person's equality, or that dignity, then perhaps we're going to take yours away as well, right? Okay, now the last one are several procedural issues, right? So several procedural things. There's tons of years between sentencing and the death actually occurring. I don't know the statistic here, but it's decades generally, right, between when you're sentenced to death and when you're actually put to death. And some people say, look, that's added suffering, right? The victim of the murder wasn't told they were going to die and then had to, live through 10 years of anticipating and waiting for that to happen, right? And so that makes it unequal, right? Another procedural issue is that sometimes innocent people are put to death. And then finally, another procedural issue is that it's race biased, right? Evidence suggests that it's much more likely for black people to receive the death penalty, especially if it's a black person killing a white person is much more likely to result in the death penalty, right? And so some people say that's another reason we shouldn't have the death penalty, right? It's race biased. It's got these issues. Primoratz he's not going to deny those issues, right? I mean, they're just statistically true, right? You can just look at it. But he says all of that's procedural, right? So what he wants to say here is it doesn't show that the death penalty is wrong. It just shows we need to change the procedure, right? We need to actively work to reduce the years between sentencing, right? Or we need to recognize that that's actually valuable to the person because it ensures that they have proper channels for appeals, right? We could stop using the death penalty unless we're very, very sure, right? We could stop using it in cases where there's not clear, solid evidence of whatever standard we think is appropriate. And we could actively work to make sure that there is not race bias, right? He says we could change the procedures and address those issues. None of those issues really says, though, that the death penalty itself is wrong. It just says how we're administering the death penalty is wrong, right? So Primoratz, at the end of the day, says it seems like we should have the death penalty. It seems like as a matter of justice, it's a matter of reciprocity, it's a matter of retribution, we need the death penalty as an option. Okay, so next time we'll hear some arguments against the death penalty.